Okay, today we are going to talk about first chapter tips and tricks because we have the first chapter contest coming up. I will start advertising it as soon as the scary story contest goes down, which is October 11th, and it will be due on December 20th. So we'll have about 2-ish months to work on it, give or take a little. Um, that being said, a lot of you guys talked about the fact that you would like more tips and tricks because it's always good to learn more about how to make a good first chapter better. So we're going to talk about some of the struggles that were in last year's first chapters. Not necessarily like calling anyone out, just more saying like these are things I noticed in general that made it so that people got lower scores. As well as just in general, what makes a good first chapter period. What did the winners do? That was fantastic too. Calling out both sides. All right. So with that being said, first we're going to talk about the first sentence. Does the first sentence matter? Absolutely. This matters in a short story, this matters in a novel, this matters in a first chapter. It does not matter what you're writing. If that first sentence is really, really boring or really, really confusing, your readers are immediately going to be put with an off feeling in their stomach, if you will, that you are eating a great food. What are your favorite foods? But your first bite of that food, you get an incredibly salty bite. Plainly salty. Do you want to eat the rest of it?
Yes.
Some people do.
Sorry.
Illustrating my point good.
I don't like salty food.
But see, that's my point. Some people will continue to read even if the first sentence is terrible. So good illustrating my point. But two of you were like, heck to the no, you gross, immediately revolted. And that's what most readers are going to think. 99% of readers are going to be like, ew, gross, if the first sentence is confusing or boring. And they're not going to want to read the rest of it because the rest of your story ever written. But if the first sentence is boring or confusing, they don't really care. Right? They get that bad taste in their mouth for your story and they're like, I assume the rest of the story will be as bad as this first bite.
The critics reading the book.
A little bit. But see, that's the thing though. First bite is what really matters. It's like a food critic. If a food critic is eating a dish and the first bite they get is super, super salty, that is gonna seriously tank your review.
I don't think I should be a food critic.
Meanwhile, though, you might get a few people who read through. That's why it's important to have beta readers. And it's extra important to have a lot of beta readers because you might have skewed opinions. Or maybe 3 of your friends are like, I love this first. And then you go to talk to 3 other friends and they're like, this first sentence could be better. And then as a result, you can, if it's 50-50, something needs to change. Or heck, even if it's 70, something needs to 30. I can math. Something needs to change. Point is, if half or more agree that it needs to change, then it probably does need to change. Now, if you have 1 out of let's say 10 beta readers say, ugh, Titans,
Pish posh.
exactly, pish posh, move on. But if you have 9 out of your 10 beta readers say you need to fix this first sentence, and 1 person says, I love it, maybe discount the I love it person. Yeah, and listen to the rest. So, does that mean that your first sentence is truly bad? No, it just means it needs some tweaking. So, we're going to talk about what things do make a good first sentence. So, first thing that we're going to talk about is things that can hurt your first sentence. If it is too and winding, if you read your first sentence and you're having to go towards the end because you forgot to take a breath, too long, entirely too long. And I would say typically your first sentence should be short and snappy because it's going to pull your reader into the book more. If your first sentence is, I would say, 10 words or longer, you're probably going to get into territory of, oh my gosh, I'm having trouble reading this. What is going on? If you keep it to 10 words or less, you'll probably be okay. That typically makes it better. But I will say the shorter the sentence, the snappier the sentence, just the better. Next is too much telling and not enough showing. Now, is tactful telling bad? No. However, you've also got to keep in mind with tactful telling that there can be such a thing as too much tactful telling. And there can also be such a thing as losing your voice. This was something I actually noticed with one of the recent Scary Story Contest entries, unfortunately, where I actually really loved their humorous voice. They had a very comedic, fun voice for like the first 2 paragraphs. And then they just completely dropped it. and stopped being comedic at all and just started telling me the story in a very boring sort of way. And I was like, you started off so good, and then you just were like, meh, you threw it all out. And so you need to do the same thing with your story. If you start with something like, for example, Percy Jackson, you don't want to be a half-blood. He's immediately telling the reader, no. And you're like, first of all, what's a half-blood? Second of all, now I kind of want to be one, so tell me why. But also, it makes it so that you start listening to him, right? Pacing up that entire book. He never drops it. So if you are going to do tactful telling like that, you got to make sure you don't drop it. Keep it up. Make sure you can keep up that energy. If that energy is not something you can keep up, maybe don't start with tactful telling.
My first sentence is just 3 words.
3 words is good. 3 words is snappy.
Mine was lost.
So, next thing is too much description and not enough action. Do you need to describe your character? Yes. Do you need to describe your setting? Yes. Those are all things that should be done within the first paragraph, not necessarily within some description in within the first sentence. Yes. If you put too much description in the first sentence, that's when you get a long, winding, I can't breathe by the end of the sentence. Because you're trying to be like, they were in Scotland and she has black hair and she has green eyes, and it's like, okay, do we need to know all that right now? Probably not. And then the next thing is not having enough action. Your first sentence should either pose a question or have action. So when I say action, it means emotional action or physical action. So, for example, another first sentence that I've read before that I really liked was, I hated those mustard walls. And makes you go, what? And so you want to keep reading. Exactly. You're posed a question. You're like, okay, what is happening here? And it has this emotion behind it and this confusion that makes you want to keep reading.
But what about the ketchup bowl?
There's that too, where you're like, okay, what is it about these walls that makes them mustard? Why does she hate them so much? You know, all these details that make you go, I'm interested. You know? And with that being said, so you either want to pose a question, have action, or both. And when I say action, it can always be something like they're running down the street, or it could be something like a car chase, or it could even just be something like, that's the moment when I slapped him on the face. And it's like, I want to keep reading because I want to know why she slapped him. It's like, I'm intrigued now.
Slap it to the face.
So, next thing with a first sentence that you want to take into mind that is a good thing. You want to make sure that your first sentence is going to introduce some aspect of your character or the plot. So that's why having a just purely descriptive first sentence doesn't necessarily do that for you. Unless, for example, you're in some crazy, insane place, in which case it kind of does describe things. For example, if you're like, I am currently in the Feywild, so you're just going, okay. It may only give setting, but you're going, okay, why does this matter? Why are you in the Feywild? So, with that being said, you need to make sure that first paragraph also gives us a sense of who the character is, while not being too boring. So moving on to the first paragraph, the best thing you can do is to give us a sense of the character's place in the world. So a great example of this is the Hunger Games. The first sentence is, the other side of the bed was cold. It sounds a little boring, but then you read the next sentence where she says she's reaching to see where her sister is. And you're like, okay, so she sleeps in the same bed as her sister. That's very protective of her. That's very loving of her. That's very interesting. Not a lot of siblings do that, unless they're either forced to, which it seems like she cares. And then it moves on to say that, of course, she probably had nightmares because the reaping is coming up. And by the end of the first paragraph, you're going, okay, I have a lot of questions and I need them all answered. And so as a result, that's another thing you want to make sure you do. By the end of the first paragraph, you need someone asking what is going on. And last but not least, with first paragraphs, they should be 5 sentences to 7 sentences. And when I say sentences, I mean 10 words or less. I do not mean run-on sentences. I recently ran into a paragraph in one of the scary stories for the first paragraph that was entirely too long. It should have been at least 2 to 3 paragraphs because it had like 15 sentences in it. That is too long for a first paragraph. Too many. You need to know when to split things off. I know that it's hard to fit everything in the first paragraph, but you can. I promise. It's doable. All right. Next thing that we're going to talk about. All right. So make sure that your world building is not confusing. Now, posing questions is different from confusing. For example, in the Hunger Games, where she says, today's the reaping. We don't know what the reaping is, but we do know that we're curious about it, right? If she just started info dumping on us all about the reaping, we might be like, okay, A, I'm bored, B, I'm confused, please stop. But she introduces it in a very slow, kind of methodical way that makes it so we're all like, okay, we can slowly ingest what's happening here, instead of being like, by the way, the reaping is, tells us fun facts about the reaping for 20 minutes. No, not going to be helpful. Speaking of which, when you are world building or doing your character building, please avoid info dumping. Now, I know it's fun to tell your people all about your characters. I get it. It's fun. But info dumping is for friends and family when you're talking to them about your book, not actually in your book. Talk to your friends and family about your info dumping. Tell them all about your characters. Find someone that you love to tell about your characters and do it all the time. But just make sure that it stays between relationships and not on the pages.
That book sounds cool. Tell me more about it.
Exactly. That's not a problem. But as long as it's not put on the actual page. All right. Next thing you need to take into account. More than 3 characters should not be introduced. Why? Because of the fact that if you start getting into more than 3 characters by name, and they are important to the story, we're going to start losing track very quickly. And as a result, we're going to sit there and be like, what just happened? Who was that again? But if you have 3, you can typically be like, oh, okay. And even if you have people you're going to introduce but are important later, you can always have them be nameless right now. I believe that's one thing. It's been a while since I've read it, but I believe that's what Percy Jackson actually did when they first met Clarice. Basically, she just straight up bullied him. We didn't know who this rando was, but she was just a jerk. And then all of a sudden, she got introduced later because she became more important as a quintessential character. However, he realized that now was not the time to introduce her. Now was just the time to be like, hey, there's a girl, she's bullying him, she's mean. That's all you need to know. So remember what's important for right now. Not the whole plot, right now. All right, next. So, make sure to set the mood with your words. For example, if you are writing a very elegant story, you might say, she traipsed through the fields. Whereas if you're writing a very scary story, you might say, the whipping of her dress in the wind reminded him of the crackling of bones in a fire, or something like that. That's very ominous.
Wait, what is a crackle in a fire?
Excellent question. But see, that's the thing. It makes it more ominously toned, right? Whereas the first one makes it more whimsical, more elegant. So it depends on what tone you're going for your story. Make sure that if you're trying to write a comedy, that you describe it very comedically. Maybe say the way she traipsed through the field remind him of a duckling falling down a set of stairs. Like that is a very exactly. See, it makes you laugh. It makes you go, what the heck? And so you got to set the tone with your words. You can describe the same scene 7 or 8 different ways, and it will entirely set the very different. All right, next. Some people will say this to you, and I want you to consider it carefully. Some people, that is absolutely what they need to do. Other people, not so much. Some people will recommend to you axing your first chapter completely and making your second chapter your first chapter. Sometimes that's right, because you do too much info dumping, you do too much of this, you do too much of that, and by the time you hit your second chapter, you've got that all out of your system, and you've actually written a good chapter. Sometimes that's true. It can happen. But I would say take into account, really get a good look at your chapter and say, is there value here? If the answer is yes, then rewrite, redo, re-summarize, look at it again. But if you look at the chapter and you're like, yeah, it's really kind of boring and confusing, then consider axing it off and starting with chapter 2. Oftentimes, that's when people tend to find their voice the best. But not always true. All right. Next thing that we're going to talk about. How to make your characters sympathetic without following one of the following tropes. Either she's not like other girls, or he's not like other boys, or that she's exactly average, or he's exactly average, or they, whatever. Point is, there are two tropes, and it's either I am perfectly average, but I am chosen to save the world, or I am not average, and that's why everyone loves me. And then they do very average things, despite the fact that they are not average. Yeah, there's a few problems here. So you can make them
a narcissist.
You can make them sympathetic without causing problems. And do you need to make them sympathetic? Yes. Do you have to have character growth? Also yes. However, keep in mind that if your character starts out as a jerk, we won't read long enough to get to the ending. Jane Austen's Emma. Anyway, other people may disagree with me, but I think that was she was entirely too stuck up in the beginning. I saw no redeeming value in her, and so I couldn't even finish the book to where she supposedly got better. Everyone's like, but she got better, and I'm like, in 365 pages, entirely too long. But if you have some redeeming value, that's what makes us hook to those characters and go, oh, I want to keep reading. I want to figure out what's going on. A great example of this, though it's not reading, is Avatar The Last Airbender with Zuko. Zuko, you immediately are like, exactly, you're like intrigued by this rando who's super obsessed about honor. But then when you realize, but then when you quickly realize, I believe it's episode 3, that they introduce Zuko's backstory, and he basically says, hey, you know the reason why he was outcast? It was because he stood up for a bunch of troops and said that his dad shouldn't make them cannon fodder. And everyone's like, oh, I suddenly like him more. And so it made him sympathetic even though he was a jerk. So you got to make sure you make them sympathetic even though they were a jerk. Now, the thing a lot of people like to say about, I will say about Emma with Jane Austen, is that she was foregoing courting and stuff like that because she wanted to help take care of her family. The only problem is back then, getting married actually would have helped take care of her family. So that's one of those stop, wait a minute, bullcrap moments. But that's why I didn't like her anyway, because I was like, I smell fishy. But anyway, so moving forward with that, with making your characters sympathetic, you can have them be a jerk and have them be sympathetic, but you've got to make sure that if they are a jerk, they actually become less of a jerk by the end. If they stay a jerk by the end, then we're not going to want to keep reading the second book, right? So, you got to either have them be sympathetic from the beginning, or you've got to have them become less of a jerk by the end of the book. So, speaking of that, great example of this is Percy Jackson. I'm going to go with Percy Jackson and Hunger Games the whole time just because they're great examples. Hunger Games makes her very sympathetic because she's the protector of her family. She loves her sister with all of her heart. She loves her mom with all of her heart. She wishes she could do anything for them, including get herself killed to keep them safe. She would literally do anything for them. And meanwhile, with Percy Jackson, his mom literally gets kidnapped in the first one. And you're like, dude, that sucks. And so you feel sympathetic for him. You also feel sympathetic for him because he's kind of the dork who gets bullied in the beginning. And a lot of us can unfortunately resonate with that.
I started reading it and I'm only on like the 7th chapter, so I'm like,
I promise. I will not tell you anything important. I will simply tell you that Percy Jackson is amazing. It's a good book. Keep reading. All right. So, moving forward with that, with first chapters, the other problem that you're going to run into is don't tell us the whole story in the first chapter. Otherwise, why do we keep reading? A lot of people tend to accidentally do this. I noticed this with, I think it was 3 different first chapters in the first chapter contest last year that I was like, okay, it's a great short story. It's not a good first chapter. Now, the thing is, can a first chapter be a short story? Yes. The way you do it right is by having at least some sort of cliffhanger at the end. Exactly. Or even just something that resonates. Like for example, let's say a great example of this. I'm going to use it because I've been enjoying this TV show recently, even though you guys may or may not have watched it because it's kind of scary. Is Supernatural. So in the beginning, first episode, they literally are like, so our dad is off hunting demons and ghosts, and we need to go find him. And so they go find their dad, and they're like, well, we didn't find our dad, but we did find this other thing, and so maybe he just wanted us to get rid of this Wendigo, and he'll like show up later. But at the end of the episode, something very dramatic, no spoilers, happens to one of the characters and makes it so that as a result to keep going ghost hunting and keep going demon hunting, even though he didn't want to. And that makes it so that way you feel like you want to keep reading. If that was a first chapter, I would be like, oh, dude, that sucks. I want to keep reading about this guy and find out what happened to him. Instead of being like, oh, well, they caught the thing and their dad's missing, but oh well, yay. Exactly, like, yay. You gotta have some reasons why we want to keep reading, why the characters want to keep going. If you just write a thing where you're like, okay, and they met a dragon and they became friends with the dragon and they lived happily ever after, but also next time see them at the waterfall. It's like, why do I want to see them at the waterfall? They're happily ever after the end. Cool. Like, well, what exactly? What? You had the perfect reaction. That was me. What? So you got to make sure that if you're going to do a story that's a love story or an action story or a fantasy story, that if you're going to do the short story first chapter method, you got to have a cliffhanger of some sort. You can still resolve it while having a cliffhanger. For example, let's say one of the chapters that I thought had a lot of potential as a short story, but not as a first chapter, was about two characters falling in love for the first time and admitting that they had a crush on each other. But by the end of it, they were just cute and adorable. And I was like, this is a great short story, but not a great first chapter. The only reason that I would want to keep reading this is if there's some sort of drama. Like, let's say he gives a sinister smile and there's a knife in his pocket. Then I'm like, oh no, she's in danger, you know? Or alternatively, maybe he's sitting there going like, yes, it's so good to be with you and everything. And she's like, it's good to be with you too, Charlie. And he's like, who's Charlie? And she's like, what do you mean you're Charlie? And he's sitting there like, I'm not Charlie. And then we're all confused. And then I want to read more because I want to know what the heck just happened. Or even just at the end, one of the guys comes out of the corner and he goes, so you said that you were in love with me, but were you really in love with me? Because he's my identical twin, or something like that. And then you're like, drama. And so it's important that if you're going to keep us going the short story first chapter method, you gotta have something that makes us want to keep reading. The only reason that you'd want to keep reading that one is if you just wanted to read a fluffy romance, which, nothing wrong with that. But most of the time you need more than just fluff in order to keep us going. All right. Last but most certainly not least, make sure your world building and your characters are solid. The biggest thing that publishing houses will nix you for and contests will nix you for is character and world building inconsistencies. I even saw this while I was in a publishing house. I think I've mentioned this before, where we were supposed to be voting on which stories got passed through and which ones got passed up and got rejected. And I was really sad because the world building was so cool for this one story. But the character kept being like, I'm not going to go on adventures. Okay, adventure. And it was like, there was enough character inconsistency that even though I was like, I think we could fix this, I think we could edit it, I think we could make it better, everyone else was like, but it's work. And unfortunately, that makes both contest people and publishing people go, because and so as a result they don't do it. Even if you have all the promising stories in the world, if you have inconsistent characters or inconsistent world building, that makes publishers and contest people go and they get frustrated and they're like, seems like too much work, and they stop. So you got to make sure that your world building is solid and consistent and clear, and you got to make sure that your characters, it's clear why they make different decisions. For example, I actually recently worked with an editing client, and I'm still working with her. She's lovely. She's awesome. But the first draft of her novel, I reached a point where I said, uh-oh, I don't actually know why she cares about this decision. And that's important. It seems like she just flips the switch, goes from A to B feelings and actions. And I was like, this feels inconsistent. And then when I talked with her, she's like, oh, it's not inconsistent because of A, B, and C. And I was like, you didn't show A, B, and C. You implied A, B, and C, but you did not show us A, B, and C. And as a result, I, as an editor and a reader, am very confused. And this feels totally out of left field. And so she then went back and rewrote the scene. And now that A, B, and C have been established, it flows beautifully. It makes it very clear that she's like, okay, I'm changing my decisions based on this issue. For example, in this specific issue, it was the fact that they wanted to protect people. And they decided that the best way to protect them was to go into hiding, and that that was going to keep them safe. And so they go into hiding, everything goes wrong, and they end up in danger anyway. And so she realizes that staying out of this is not going to keep them safe. And that's why she changed her mind to engage. But I thought she just went from, let's go hide, to, I'm going to fight now. And I'm like, but why? Why'd you suddenly turn aggressive? You went from go hide in a corner to aggressive. And it seemed drastic. But when I learned that she was trying to do it to protect her family, I went, oh, okay. And she realized the only way to protect her family was to be aggressive. So sometimes character inconsistencies can be that simple, just about clarifying with your reader why they are doing what they are doing. It's not always that they are being inconsistent. It's sometimes just that you know what the character's thinking, but you haven't told the reader. And that's important to do as well. So keep in mind with your first chapter that your world building needs to be clear, but your character's motives also need to be clear. Okay. Last thing that we're going to talk about is villains. Should you introduce the villain in the first chapter? Not necessarily. Yeah, I was going to say you can, but you don't have to. I would actually say if you do, don't force it. Make sure it's organic. Like if they're in a car chase, you can have the villain, point a gun at them epically as they're doing a car chase and try to shoot at them. That
Or
can
have
introduce
this
them
random guy
seamlessly.
appear and he's like,
Yes.
but they have no idea who he is.
Exactly.
And they have no idea who he works for.
Yeah, you could totally have this ominous figure where you're just like, what is going on? Why does he want us dead? No one knows, but he's clearly evil, And so you can have things like that where you introduce them, but you should info dumping the villain's backstory in the beginning, unless you do a fancy dancy prologue. If you want to do a prologue with the villain's backstory and do like a little quick moment where you have like a scene from the villain's backstory, you can do that. It's one of my favorite things that I've actually seen from this book called Meeting Twilight. She does a great job. She always has the prologue be from the villain's point of view. It's really cool. But then the rest of the book is from the point of view of the main three characters. But keeping that in mind, you don't always have to introduce the villain within the first chapter or the prologue. You can wait. What you do have to do is introduce, though, the inciting incident. What is going to change their whole world? What is going to change everything? What is going to make the world different? Now, if that is the villain, great. It may not be the villain, though. It may just be the consequences of the villain. For example, the first chapter in the Meeting Twilight book that I was just talking about, the inciting incident is the fact that she finishes her first day of school and she's feeling, pretty dang solid about it, but she keeps getting all of these people doing weird things and saying weird things to her and being really shifty and shady around her. And she's like, I'm going to figure out what the secret is at this school. And so that's her inciting incident, is I'm going to figure out what this secret is. And then it gets even trickier because then her parents go missing. And so so even though that's technically in the second chapter, the first chapter still makes us go, what's the secret at the school? And then when the secret at the school affects her parents' disappearance, then it makes us go, oh.
I made my second chapter make his parents disappear.
So you can have those kinds of things where technically the inciting incident happens in the second chapter. But if you're going to do that, you got to have the first chapter where the thing that is going to cause the inciting incident is hinted at, is made clear, is made like a little taste of intrigue or interest. Yes, gives you a little makes you want more rather than being like, oh, okay, I'm good. I can close the book and be done now. Not even necessarily that that's bad. It's just if your reader is content to close the book after the first chapter, that's not a very good first chapter. That's a good short story, but it's not a good first chapter. All right. Any questions about first chapter stuff that we just talked about? I know that that was a lot, but do we have any questions? No? Okay, cool. All right. As I said at the beginning, the Scary Story contests are due on the October 11th. And keep in mind, with this contest, you can enter as many times colors per entry. So keep in mind, obviously, it costs. Yes, can you enter multiple times? Sure, but be careful because money. Also, keep in mind, um, the next one is the first chapter contest, and that isn't due until December 20th. So if you want to start it now, you are welcome to. But know that you have a lot of time to work on it, so don't feel rushed. Also, don't be like, cranking it out the night before because that can be more stressful, but at the same time, don't feel rushed. Start it now slowly. If you started it now slowly, since I have a 3,000 word limit, you could write like 1,000 words per day and easily be done in the next couple days. Or even if you wanted to, you could break down even smaller and say like 200 words per day and be done in the next 2 weeks, and then have the rest of the time for revision. If you plan it out well, this could be smooth, I guess is my point. So don't stress yourself out unnecessarily. Do I want to see you enter? Yes. But also, don't panic. I don't want to cause you stress. All right. I'm going to turn off the video and work on writing and other things. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns or anything like that. Especially regarding the Scary Story contest, just because I am one of the judges, so don't tell me what your story is about, but you can ask me questions. And I'm more than happy to answer them.